It's a pleasure for me to host or moderate this session with Jason Furman and Kevin Hassett. I'll introduce them briefly. First, my name is Neda Issa. I'm at the McCourt School of Public Policy. I'm an associate professor. The two panelists we have today are first, as I said, Jason Furman. Jason is a professor of the practice of economic policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and the Department of Economics at Harvard. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And he but he served 8 years as a top economic advisor to President Obama, including serving as the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for 4 years. Kevin Hassett is now vice president and managing director of the Lindsey Group and a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and CNN economics commentator. Kevin was also a senior advisor to President Trump and the 29th chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Trump. So let me start the discussion. We don't have much time, so let me just start the discussion. What we're talking about here is economic policy for the new incoming administration. So I would say it's an understatement to say that this new administration is facing some daunting challenges. The virus there's a resurgence of the virus. We're seeing some of the effects of that now with unemployment benefit applications actually rising, signaling a slowdown in the labor market. We're seeing disruptions to travel as travelers are canceling plans for Thanksgiving, and who knows what the holiday season will look like. I think the question for you, Jason and Kevin, is what impact do you think this is going to have on the new administration coming in? And do you have confidence that they're going to be bold enough to address these challenges, especially now, as I said, there is a resurgence, and it looks like even with a vaccine, it will take some time before we can get the virus under control. Let's start, Jason, maybe we could start with you.
Great. Thanks so much for hosting the two of us for this discussion. As I see it in the economy, there's a supply problem caused by a virus that makes it impossible to produce all sorts of things like a full restaurant. There's a demand problem. People don't have enough money to afford things. And there's another form of a supply problem, but I'll call it a reallocation problem. Businesses closed, people lost their jobs. They need to go find new jobs and new businesses and new industries. I'm very hopeful that the vaccine will solve the supply problem. It's going to take too long. There's a lot of pain and suffering, death between now and then, but it will solve it. The demand problem could outlast the supply problem if we don't act in a big way. We need to do a lot for helping states, for unemployment insurance, for nutritional assistance, and for much, much more. And then finally, and if we do that, then we can avoid, once the restaurants are allowed to open fully, people will be able to afford to go into the restaurants. Otherwise, the economic problems will outlast the virus. Finally, though, there's the reallocation problem. All the people that have lost jobs need to find jobs in new industries and the like. That's the toughest to solve. We don't know exactly what to do on it. But again, an ambitious effort to solve the virus itself, to give people demand itself, will reduce the extent of that reallocation and the burden that policy would have for that.
Kevin is.
Yeah, thanks, Neda. Jason, I agree about 100% with his assessment, and I think that the setting is that the third quarter, the economy recaptured a chunk of what it lost in the second quarter during the shutdown. Right now, GDP now is saying that fourth quarter is going to be up about 6%, which means that will almost have gotten back, or maybe a little bit above, gotten back to the level before the crisis. But Vice President Biden said that we're going to have a long, dark winter. And the sad truth is that we're at a point where we should, in all likelihood, experience in January a shock similar to what happened in the second quarter. And the reason is, as you mentioned, that the virus cases are skyrocketing, but also there's sort of what economists would say, sort of dynamic programming logic of what happens when you get close to the end of a problem, in the sense that the virus is absolutely raging out of control, but we've got a couple of vaccines that are very close to approval. And because the prevalence of the virus is so high, then it's going to be pretty easy to evaluate a whole bunch of the other vaccines too, because the problem is if the prevalence is low, then like the control group might not have any cases either, right? And so it's really hard to tell whether the vaccine works. And so I think that you're looking at something like a 3 to 4 month period where we ought to have enough vaccines to vaccinate just about every American, and then to, of course, people around the world as well. But it's optimal between now and then for everybody to hunker down even more than they have been. Right? Like, so if you really don't know if there's going to be a vaccine, if this is something that might last years and years, then you really got to kind of try to get on with keeping your business going and so on. But if you really know that a month from now, say, I know it's not that soon, that a huge number of people are going to be vaccinated, then the time between now and then is a time when a shutdown, I'm not saying the government should order a shutdown, but just each of us should be like way more cautious about leaving home or doing anything risky, because a month from now, you're going to be able to say, get a vaccine, or maybe 2 or 3 months from now. And so I expect that the sort of big negative disruption that we saw in the second quarter, because people were, explicitly shut down by governments, we're going to start to see all over the place, because people start to just sort of wind back their activity in advance of getting a vaccine. And that means that despite the fact that we're running into the year with a lot more economic momentum than I expected, or probably Jason expected, that it doesn't mean that we're out of the water economically. And it really is important to have a stimulus in the lame duck session, because we're going to need more PPP loans to keep businesses alive, more UI benefits to help the unemployed workers that are going to be increasingly unemployed because of the increase in sort of risk-averse behavior. And probably, as Jason said, demand is a problem too. So at the very least, the sort of lump sum payments like we made before in the previous CARES Act is something that they should try to pass in the lame duck. And I think I'm wary that they'll wait until March or something when Vice President Biden and his team are in there. I think that the real urgent economic mess is going to be January and February or so, and so it's important to get out in front of that right now. And so I think that the risk to the outlook, and I'll kick it back to you, Ned, I don't mean to filibuster, is just that if our elected officials don't see that reality and they fail to act in December, then there's going to be a world of hurt in January and February.
Yeah, so I think that's clear that there's agreement here, strong agreement that we need some kind of stimulus sooner rather than later. So let me shift a little bit to the kind of longer term. And clearly there's a lot of uncertainty that remains. I think one thing we can be sure of is that the post-pandemic or post-COVID economy is going to look different than the economy that we went into the pandemic with. So for example, technology now permeates every aspect of our lives, from business to education. The question for you guys is, how do you see this transition playing out? And how should policy adapt? Are we thinking about the right set of policies? Do we need to update our policies for the changes that are happening? Do we need to think about new instruments? And do we have confidence that that we're going to get the right kind of proposals from the administration?
Jace, you want to go first again, or?
Yeah, Nada. So first of all, you just used the word transition. This wasn't the sense you meant it in, but I'm just, so angry about the lack of a transition to President-elect Biden. And, I remember the flawless transition we had from the Bush administration, how critical the information that I got from both the career and political people were. I remember President-elect Trump team being in the White House pretty quickly after the election, we opened the door to them, gave them everything we could. I know this wasn't your question, but it just, file frivolous lawsuit after frivolous lawsuit, I don't care. But let the president-elect's team be able to have access to things. I'd be curious to hear what Kevin thinks about that. In terms of going forward, I think the pandemic 5 years from now will have resulted in fewer changes than many people might speculate. I think a moment like this is a time when a lot of people reach for their now more than ever argument. They take whatever it is they were in favor of before and argue the pandemic reinforces the importance of what they were in favor of before. I'm no exception to the now more than ever arguments. So things like paid leave, childcare, reforming the unemployment insurance system, and most importantly, doing more for health coverage. I think this just highlighted how important all of that was. Obviously, infrastructure and greening the economy, dealing with another risk we're facing in the future, a tail risk around climate change, is especially important, if anything, more so now than in the past. But I am curious. Sorry to Kevin. The transition thing has just been bugging me.
Oh yeah, sure. I can understand that it would bug you. To put it in context, Jason, that you probably remember this, but a very small group of us had to manage the Bush transition because of the Florida recount, and that President Bush's team wasn't allowed access to transition resources until I think it was the 14th of December. But that was a much closer election. Right, you could argue that. So I mean, whether the litigation makes sense or not, I'm not a lawyer, but it is the case that when there's
oh, and then of course the 9/11 Commission said that was bad. He did get the PDB during that time, which President-elect Biden isn't getting, and the margin in this election is even larger than the margin was 4 years ago.
I can see that, but moving on to the changes that I think that it's very, very much the case that this is going to have long-term effects that we're only beginning to realize. That all of these kids who have been separated from schools, Dan Hammermesh has a paper where he expects that there's going to be permanent problems for them academically. The way to think about it is if you didn't really learn fourth grade because you didn't really have a fourth grade, you're doing it from home, and then suddenly you're in fifth grade, then you could go back and do the fourth grade stuff and add a year at the end. But if you don't do that, then there's sort of a year missing from your schooling when you graduate from high school that's sort of gone forever. And I think that education scholars are just beginning to dig into the sort of long run harm from that. I think Marianne Wanamaker wrote a really interesting piece, which would be easy to Google. She's a labor economist at the University of Tennessee. The title was about the future of work is now. And she talked about how all these things that we're doing like right now in this conference, having a Zoom rather than meeting in person, that we've all sort of adjusted to sort of putting technology more into our work lives in a way that'll probably persist, whether Jason and I are flying around so much to give speeches at conferences and so on. I'm not so sure that that's ever going to come back. In terms of positive things, one of the things that's most interesting to me about this COVID crisis is that the flu season in the Southern Hemisphere basically didn't happen. Because everybody's been so aggressive about wearing masks and doing things to help prevent the spread of COVID that it's had a huge effect on the spread of flu. And, one could hope that the sort of positive hygiene lessons that we've all learned from this would have some positive health effects, because if we really did get ahead of the curve on flu from now on, that's like a massive economic loss every winter that will be, reduced significantly by the positive behaviors that we've learned this time. But for the most part, I think that just the acceleration of integration of technology into everything we do is going to be the sort of economic legacy that's most lasting.
So let me follow up on that, because I think that one of the things that's come out of this pandemic is that we do have these wide, just vast gaps between people defined by skill. So there's essentially been no impact on a certain segment of workers. And you mentioned now, Kevin, the impact of loss in schooling. That's also kind of playing into some of the inequalities that we're seeing. And the question is, where do we go with that? Where what is the impact of these changes being permanent? You say now technology is going to be permanently a part of our lives. Does that mean a segment of the population then is going to be challenged in terms of labor market opportunities? And what should the policy response look like?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at labor markets from around 2014 through 2019, you saw a low and falling unemployment rate for workers with high school degree, for Black workers. You saw the fastest wage gains at the bottom of the income distribution. Part of that was a tight labor market reduces inequality. Part of that was a lot of states and cities chose to raise their minimum wage, and that brought up wages a lot, especially at something like the 10th percentile. And getting ourselves back to that as quickly as we can is really important. That's where the aggregate stimulus comes in. That's why the Fed is so important, and I think the rules that they've adopted under Chair Powell and the goals they have in terms of average inflation targeting, waiting until you see the inflation, are so important. But we also do need to do more, both in the short run to raise market wages. I cited the minimum wage as one example, more worker bargaining power, less monopolies. More in the long run to raise worker wages. Education are the three most important things there. And finally, even with all of that, I don't know that we're going to be fully content with the distribution the market generates. And so having a progressive tax and transfer system that helps ensure the gains are shared, that everyone can participate in the benefits of the economy, I think is important in its own right, and for the broader support we'd all like to see. And that's a big important agenda. And just like I said before, it's more important than ever.
Yeah, I agree with Jason's emphasis at the beginning of getting a really, really hot economy and a low unemployment rate. That's the best way to improve the welfare of people at the bottom couple of deciles. And I think that we were it's like, what are the great, there's a million tragedies of COVID, but what are the great inequality effects of COVID was that we were seeing big reductions in income inequality right before the pandemic struck, precisely because the unemployment rate was so low. We saw a similar period, by the way, near the end of the Clinton administration, that you had sort of run the unemployment rate so low that the labor market was so tight that people were sort of bidding marginal workers' prices way up, and you could really see it in the data. And so that, sadly, like that part of it is going to be something that probably takes a couple, like suppose that we have a really optimal response to the current situation and we head right back onto the right path, then I think until you get the unemployment rate below like 4.5 or something, you're not likely to see that kind of a force in labor markets. And so it's probably going to be a year or two of like really aggressive economic stewardship before we get back to that kind of positive outcome. And so I think it's right to think about other things we can do along the way.
So everything you both kind of pointed out to suggests we need to either raise more revenue, a lot more revenue, or go into more debt. I know, Jason, you've talked about whether or not we should be concerned about the debt levels, but let me go to the tax side first. So Biden's tax plan has proposed increasing taxes on corporate income as well as personal income. What do you see as the economic effects of the Biden tax plan?
Yeah, I mean, the Penn-Wharton budget model is run by a guy named Kent Smetters. I think, was he your colleague, Nada?
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And Kent was when the Republicans formed a dynamic scoring commission. He was the Republican appointee to it. So he's a real expert in the topic. And he looked at the tax plan and said the Biden tax plan plus immigration plan would be a positive for GDP. The Biden tax plan itself would be about a zero impact on GDP. The zero impact on GDP came because there were some puts and takes, some things like discouraging investment overseas, encouraging investment in the United States on one side of the ledger, higher tax rates on the other side of the ledger. The American Enterprise Institute has open source modeling. I think Kevin was one of the people that helped set that up. And the American Enterprise Institute model found a minuscule negative effect on GDP over the next decade, a minuscule positive effect on GDP over the following decade, and in the very long run, it found it would subtract 0.2 percentage points from the level of real GDP. So a range of estimates have shown very little effect of the tax plan on GDP. Pretty much, you see that from conservative think tanks, you see that from nonpartisan as well. I think more important is to ask what's going to happen to the money. Is the money going to be used well for investing in early childhood education and infrastructure, ways to grow our economy, or will the money be used poorly? So the tax part of the plan, rough zero for the economy. The tax plus investment part of the plan, if that was done well, would be a positive for the economy, as we see from the analyses from Oxford Economics, Goldman Sachs, Moody's.com, and a number of other economic outfits.
Yeah, so Jason knows that Casey Mulligan and I have a paper that was published at the Hoover Institution that has pretty strikingly different conclusions. I'm not a big fan of the models that he mentioned, and we could go, this is not an academic seminar, we could go into the errors that I think they make in construction, but by construction they get very small tax effects. And I think just to put it in like stark contrast to what the models are saying, if you just think about the tax increase on pass-through entities, if you remove the cap on Social Security tax, and so you're adding you're increasing the marginal rate and then adding the Social Security tax, both sides of it on top of that to pass-through income. Consider that pass-through entities are going to see tax rates like, maybe if you count state and local taxes up around 55, 60%, it's the biggest tax increase on pass-through entities that I can remember. They employ about half of Americans. The notion that has no effect on the economy seems like a stretch to me. But if you've got a model that shows that, then let's go to the seminar room and think about why you get that kind of result. I think when Casey and I use a neoclassical growth model and factor in all those things, we get a much different effect. But I think that question, though, not to criticize the question, of course, is probably moot in the sense that it's probably not very likely that the Biden tax plan is going to be pursued next year. And I think that there's sort of two reasons why that is. The first is that, probably the Republicans will control the Senate. I'm certainly not certain, and congratulations to Vice President Biden for winning Georgia, which is kind of a first in a long time. But the fact is that if they don't control the Congress or the Senate, then I wouldn't be surprised if something like what we saw at the beginning of the Obama administration happens, which Jason was there. And I'm sure he probably advised President Obama to hold off on the tax hikes for a year or so because we were in free fall because of the financial crisis. I think that the Bush tax cuts even had to be renewed because they were expiring, and President Obama quite prudently pursued that policy and decided that tax hikes were something that would be like, a next step after the recovery was in train. My guess is that, come February, March, if we go back to the first part of our conversation, we think that because the vaccine isn't going to be widespread yet and the cases are skyrocketing, that it's likely that people are really going to hunker down and the economy is going to be getting a big negative shock in the first quarter. Probably it's not going to be the climate where even if the Democrats sweep in Georgia, that they're going to pursue a tax hike this year, would be my guess.
Yeah, not this year perhaps, but at some point. I mean, I think there are a lot of promises and spending that needs to either happen or is likely to happen. And the question still stands as to how we finance that spending. Mm-hmm. So maybe not in its current form, but we're likely to see some kind of tax increases, no?
I mean, tax increases are hard to get done in Washington.
Yeah.
The place to start is the ones that are good for the economy. Carbon taxes, financing the infrastructure bill with gas taxes or vehicle mile travel taxes, and the like. But the ones that are good for the economy only get you so far. And so then you want to do the others. On corporate, I would love to do it as part of a tax reform. I think Kevin and I would probably agree on the benefits of making expensing permanent, limiting interest deductions. And once you do that, the types of neoclassical models that he talked about tell you can raise the tax rate and increase the growth rate as part of that plan. So I think a discussion of tax reform is always the best way to do it. I'm not incredibly optimistic that's going to happen over the next year or two.
The one thing I could say, Jason, and you and I have talked about this. Gosh, we've known each other for probably 20 years. That one of the things that does happen in Washington is that when you have a divided government, they tend to get more serious about the deficit. And there's sort of interesting game theoretic reasons why that is, because like if you have a deficit reduction package, then each side is in some sense constraining the other from doing the stuff they most want to do that the other party doesn't like. But I think that if there is a divided government, the truth is, regardless of what economic model you use, if you spend $1, then that's $1 that you have to pay back with future taxes. And we've run up massive deficits, I think, for good and bad reasons, a lot of good reasons this year with like bipartisan stimulus packages that help keep the economy afloat during this pandemic. And so at some point, somebody's going to have to pay for it. And again, the history of it is that when you have divided government, that tends to be when they get serious about deficit reduction. And so that would be like the flip side, but I don't think it would happen this year. It would maybe, and then I guess there's going to be a midterm election. So you're looking at year 3, but maybe there's going to be a big deficit reduction effort if there's a divided government.
I worry we'll get too serious about deficit reduction, but we can do that another time when we have more time.
Okay.
Let me ask one final question. It's completely different. The U.S. Supreme Court now has a conservative to liberal balance of 6-3. How do you think this will manifest itself in the coming years in terms of economic and social policy?
I'll let Jason have the last word because he's been kind enough to go first the whole time. One of the things that I think is interesting about the Supreme Court, and neither one of us are attorneys, but I do consume Supreme Court decisions, as a consumer because they're so interesting, is it's amazing how many cases are kind of unanimous. There are very few cases that are divided on political grounds. And so I think for the most part, especially in the economic policy space, that it's unlikely that the conservative majority is going to have a big impact on things. I don't really think that, that in economic policy space that we're going to pursue policies that get tossed out by the court or anything. And so I don't think that the Supreme Court is going to be super relevant. I guess that if it were to be, it would be in the regulatory space, perhaps, that maybe the Biden administration would pursue some regulations that would get litigated and then end up at the court. And then maybe they're less friendly towards regulation than a Democratic court would be. But other than that, I think it's not going to be a big part of the story going forward.
Yeah, I think on regulatory issues, it's really important. The Supreme Court basically said that carbon should be regulated as a pollutant in its endangerment finding. Will it let the EPA go through and do what it basically told the EPA to do? Antitrust is another area that's important. The Supreme Court is operating, I fear, in economics that's a couple decades behind where economics is today in thinking about antitrust. And so some of those will be constraints. Some of those could be relaxed by legislation that specified what to do about climate, what to do about antitrust. Of course, legislating in those areas will be very difficult over the next few years.
Okay, I think we are at the end of our session. Thank you very much, Kevin and Jason. It's clear we're at it's a very exciting time for economic policy, and thank you for your thoughts on on what's likely to happen in the future.